In the frozen forests, muddy fields, and endless trenches of World War II, soldiers often discovered that the smallest items, food, warmth, comfort, or even a moment of sweetness, could shape morale more powerfully than bullets or bombs. And when it came to the daily rations given to soldiers, few comparisons were more striking than the difference between what the average Wehrmacht soldier received and what the average American GI carried into battle. For many German soldiers, every day began with a familiar ritual, the issuing of 6 cigarettes. It was not a luxury, not a treat, but a substitute, a distraction to suppress hunger. By 1943, German rationing had collapsed so severely that cigarettes were routinely used to make up for missing calories. Soldiers smoked to keep their stomachs calm, to dull the sensation of emptiness, to forget the cold. And as the war dragged on, cigarettes became both currency and comfort, exchanged for bread, soap, or even the smallest piece of chocolate that had become nearly impossible to find in the collapsing Reich. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, the American soldier opened his K-Ration and found something almost unimaginable to a starving Wehrmacht infantryman, a dependable supply of chocolate. Not just any chocolate, but a carefully engineered, calorie-dense bar designed to boost morale, provide energy, and give soldiers a moment of sweetness in the middle of chaos. And unlike the Germans, whose supplies dwindled with every month of Allied bombing, the Americans never ran out. Factories back home, fueled by a booming wartime economy, produced chocolate on an industrial scale, packing millions of bars into rations shipped across the world, from Normandy beaches to Pacific jungles. But to understand just how dramatic this contrast truly was, you have to go back to the early years of the war, back to a time when the Wehrmacht seemed unbeatable. In 1939 and 1940, German soldiers were not starving. Their rations were simple but sufficient. Bread, meat, cheese, sausage, coffee, and yes, cigarettes. German industry was mobilized, supply lines were short, and conquered territories provided additional resources. Cigarettes were meant to be a bonus, not a substitute for missing meals. But Hitler's strategy changed everything. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it stretched its supply system beyond the breaking point. The distances were enormous. The roads were primitive. The winter was brutal. Food shipments were inconsistent, and by 1942, entire units were living on half rations. By 1943, the situation had become so desperate that cigarettes, lightweight, easy to transport, and addictive, became the one item Germany could reliably provide to soldiers. They could not provide meat. They could not provide chocolate. They could barely provide bread, but they could provide 6 cigarettes a day. And at the same time, the American logistical system was becoming one of the most advanced in human history. The United States did not just supply its own soldiers, it fed entire Allied armies. American farms produced more food than ever before. American factories, in partnership with Hershey, produced specialized chocolate bars that could withstand heat, survive transport, and deliver instant energy on the battlefield. While German soldiers traded cigarettes for crumbs of chocolate, American GIs had chocolate in every single K-Ration. They had it in breakfast, lunch, and dinner packs. They had chocolate in D rations. They had chocolate in emergency rations. And perhaps most importantly, they had chocolate as a symbol of comfort from home. But why was chocolate so important? For American commanders, the answer was clear: morale. A soldier who feels cared for fights longer, harder, and with more determination. Something as small as a bar of chocolate reminded the GIs that they were fighting for a country that could afford to bring comfort to the battlefield. And to many German soldiers, this fact was shocking. Letters home described encounters with captured American rations. Soldiers wrote about the unbelievable quantity of chocolate in U.S. supplies. One German wrote in disbelief, "The Americans have more chocolate than we have ammunition." And this comparison was not an exaggeration. By 1944, the German military was rationing everything: fuel, boots, wool, bread, butter, medicine. American soldiers, meanwhile, were receiving rations that included meat, coffee, fruit bars, canned meals, jam, biscuits, and multiple forms of chocolate. Even the emergency rations carried by U.S. pilots and paratroopers contained more sugar and calories than the daily food issued to many German frontline divisions. In the ruins of the Eastern Front, entire German units survived on nothing but black bread, thin soup, and their daily cigarettes. In North Africa, Rommel's men waited weeks for supply convoys that were destroyed before they arrived. By contrast, American supply ships moved across the Atlantic in massive convoys, unloaded cargo with modern machinery, and delivered food directly to field kitchens. The contrast grew even more extreme as the war approached its end. German civilians starved. Soldiers on the Western Front were surviving on half rations. Ammunition was scarce. Fuel was gone. But the cigarettes kept coming, 6 a day, like clockwork, even when there was nothing left to eat. And by 1945, many German soldiers realized something heartbreaking. They were fighting an enemy whose industrial and agricultural strength made defeat inevitable. The Americans could feed their troops better in foreign countries than Germany could inside its own borders. They had chocolate in the field, chocolate in the trenches, chocolate in the snow, chocolate in the mud, chocolate in supply dumps that stretched for miles. This difference in rations was not a small detail of the war. It was a reflection of something much larger, the clash between a collapsing authoritarian empire running out of resources and an industrial superpower that could outproduce every enemy combined. And in the middle of all this, a simple question emerged, one that thousands of German prisoners asked the moment they tasted their first American ration. How is it possible? The Americans even have chocolate in war. For them, it was evidence of a terrifying truth. They were not just outnumbered. They were outsupplied, outfed, and outproduced on a scale the world had never seen. And the real story of this contrast, the cigarettes, the chocolate, the rations, and the collapsing German supply system, is even deeper than it appears. As the war dragged into its final and most brutal years, the contrast between German and American field rations became even more stark. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers found their daily cigarette ration shrinking. What had once been a morale booster had now become a tightly controlled privilege. 6 cigarettes a day remained the official allowance, but in practice, even that was often unavailable. Supply lines were stretched, factories were bombed, and tobacco itself had become scarce. Many Wehrmacht soldiers began rationing their cigarettes the same way they rationed their food, carefully, deliberately, and with a sense of uncertainty about tomorrow. American soldiers, meanwhile, marched with pockets full of small but powerful morale boosters. Every K-Ration contained a bar of chocolate, sometimes 2. Not gourmet chocolate, not the kind that melts smoothly, but a rugged, high-calorie block designed to survive extreme conditions. And yet, for the soldiers eating them, it made all the difference. It reminded them of home. It reminded them of normal life, of childhood, of comfort. Chocolate, something simple and ordinary in America, became a symbol of abundance in a world torn apart by war. By 1944, the Americans were sending overseas not just chocolate, but hundreds of millions of cigarettes as well. But unlike the Germans, American soldiers seldom had to worry about shortages. If a unit temporarily ran out, resupply trucks almost always caught up. Logistics was America's invisible weapon, the silent giant that kept its troops fed, clothed, and supplied in ways their enemies could hardly imagine. A soldier might complain about the taste of a meal or the dryness of a D-ration bar, but very few could say they went hungry. German soldiers, however, often did. As the fronts collapsed and Allied bombing campaigns intensified, food convoys became targets. Trains carrying bread, canned meat, or tobacco were frequently destroyed long before reaching frontline troops. Many soldiers survived on watery soups, old bread, and whatever they could find in abandoned houses or farms along the retreat. In some units, cigarettes gradually turned into a form of currency. A man with a pack of smokes could trade for extra food, for a pair of socks, or even to get a letter carried home. The value of tobacco skyrocketed as morale plummeted. American troops noticed the difference immediately when they encountered Wehrmacht prisoners. Many German POWs asked for cigarettes before food. Some would trade their own rations, their own belongings, even handmade items, just to get their hands on a single American cigarette. The cultural and psychological importance of tobacco ran deep in the Wehrmacht. But even deeper was the shock German soldiers felt when they saw what Americans carried in their pockets. One German POW described his astonishment in a post-war interview. The Americans had chocolate everywhere, even in their emergency kits, even in their pockets. We couldn't imagine an army so well supplied. It felt unreal. Another recalled being offered a bar of Hershey's chocolate by an American guard. He said, "In our army, chocolate was a luxury for officers. In the American army, it was for everyone." Chocolate was not just a treat. It was a deliberate strategic choice. The U.S. War Department understood that morale was as important as bullets. A soldier who felt cared for, who felt valued, who felt a connection to home, fought longer, harder, and with more determination. Something as small as a candy bar could lift a soldier's spirits on a freezing morning in the Ardennes or a sweltering day in the Pacific. Back in Germany, tobacco shortages were becoming extreme. Civilians had long relied on ersatz substitutes, dried leaves, herbs, even shredded paper. Soldiers began doing the same. Some smoked tea leaves, others rolled ground-up plant material from fields. The taste was awful, but addiction and stress overpowered the discomfort. The 6-cigarette allowance had become an empty promise. Many reached the front with only 2 or 3 cigarettes per day, if any at all. American soldiers, on the other hand, complained when they received only their standard allowances, because they were used to more. Red Cross care packages, USO deliveries, and supply depots often distributed additional cigarettes for free. Even non-smokers received rationed cigarettes, which they could trade for chocolate or other items. The system created a kind of mini-economy within the U.S. Army, but one built on abundance rather than scarcity. For Wehrmacht soldiers, the situation worsened with every passing month. The winter of 1944-45 was especially brutal. Food was limited, resupply was unreliable, and tobacco almost vanished from the front lines. Soldiers began cutting their cigarettes in half, smoking only a few puffs, saving the rest for later. Cigarette butts found on the ground were collected, emptied, and refilled. What once had been a daily routine had turned into a desperate struggle to preserve sanity in a collapsing war. When German prisoners entered American camps, the shock they experienced went beyond material goods. They saw American guards eating well, drinking coffee, and sometimes giving away chocolate bars without a second thought. The contrast was overwhelming. One POW wrote in his diary, "We understood then that we had been fighting a nation with resources beyond our imagination. Their soldiers had chocolate, ours had nothing." Morale plays a silent but decisive role in war. While the battlefields were filled with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, the emotional and psychological endurance of soldiers mattered just as much. The Wehrmacht began the war confident, disciplined, and highly motivated. But by 1944, fatigue and hunger eroded everything. Cigarettes, once a comfort, became reminders of how little the army could provide. The Americans remained well-fed and well-supplied. Even during the darkest moments, during the Battle of the Bulge, during island assaults in the Pacific, during long marches through mud and snow, the presence of chocolate and cigarettes in ration kits gave soldiers something to hold on to. A moment of sweetness in a world of chaos. a reminder that they came from a land of plenty, fighting a war they fully believed they could win. As victory closed in, the differences became even clearer. German units surrendered with barely any supplies left. Some soldiers carried only a few pieces of bread or a handful of tobacco shreds. When American troops opened their packs in front of them, offering food and chocolate, the defeated men could hardly believe it. The war they had lived through looked completely different from the war the Americans had experienced. The material reality of logistics, the power of factories, farms, and supply lines had shaped the daily lives of millions of soldiers. But the psychological reality, the small comforts, the tokens of home, had shaped the will to fight. Cigarettes and chocolate were more than just ration items. They were symbols of two very different wartime experiences. For the Germans, scarcity. For the Americans, abundance. For the Germans, daily limits. For the Americans, daily extras. For the Germans, rationing every puff of smoke. For the Americans, sharing candy bars with friends, allies, and sometimes even enemies. When historians look back at the war, they often focus on tanks, battleships, aircraft, and strategy. But the men who fought the war remembered something else as well: the hunger, the cold, the constant stress, and the small things, like a cigarette or a bar of chocolate, that made it all just a little more bearable. German veterans later reflected on this often. Many admitted that they were shocked by how well American soldiers lived in the field. It wasn't just wealth or industry. It was planning, it was logistics. It was the belief that a comfortable soldier was a more effective soldier. The Americans understood that better than anyone. In the end, the story of 6 German cigarettes versus American chocolate is more than a comparison of rations. It is a story about 2 armies built on 2 very different foundations. One stretched thin, fighting with shrinking supplies. The other powered by massive production lines and a global network of support. The war ended, but the memories stayed. German POWs never forgot the taste of American chocolate. American soldiers never forgot the sight of German troops carefully rationing cigarettes. 2 worlds meeting in the chaos of war. One defined by scarcity, the other by abundance. And in that contrast lies one of the forgotten truths of World War II, that the small comforts carried by soldiers, sweet or smoky, revealed as much about the conflict as the massive weapons that filled the battlefields. The war was fought with steel, but it was endured with chocolate and cigarettes.